Hey everyone, my name is Heather Green. I'm one of the associate pastors here at University Methodist, and I am delighted to be joined by our very own Dr. Tom Caven. And we will be doing a quick question and answer for you all about what's going on with COVID. Thank you, Dr. Caven.
Glad to be here.
So just, can you start us off and give us a brief update on what's happening right now?
Thank you, Heather. Yes, as many of you know, there are some concerning signs with COVID right now. After we had some times in the spring when we seemed to be looking at lower numbers, we're dealing with a much more contagious variant right now. Most of you know it's the Omicron BA.5, which is very contagious, very easy to pass from person to person, and the numbers are significantly up. I think a lot of people are really struck by that. And it's also concerning to a lot of people that even if you've been vaccinated, and even if you've been vaccinated and boosted, people are still getting it. So I think a lot of people sort of feel like, are we back to square one? My message would be, no, we're not. Things are different now than they were a year ago, particularly 2 years ago. This particular variant is very contagious, but it's definitely not more severe than the previous earlier ones. Even though it's causing a lot more illness, it doesn't seem to be causing more severe illness, and it does not seem to be hospitalizing as many people. It's definitely not landing people in intensive care unit. It's definitely not putting people on ventilators. The BA.5 variant, and for that matter, the Omicron variants, all of them, tend to attach more to the upper respiratory tract, the nose, kind of the throat, maybe down and kind of to the trachea, but not going into the lung tissue like the original variants were. So consequently, that's much less likely to cause you really severe illness, much less likely to land you in the hospital, much less likely to put you on a ventilator, much less likely to cause death. 2 years ago, when we took our first precautions here, what we were really worried about is an illness that could really seriously impact somebody's health or potentially even kill them. And the good news is now, with this current variant, as contagious as it is, does not seem to be nearly as likely to have those bad outcomes.
That is really good news. And I do want to ask you, for those that do test positive, can you remind us the CDC guidelines for when we're no longer contagious, what the rules are as far as quarantining and wearing a mask?
Thank you. This is for testing positive?
This is if someone tests positive, yes sir.
Someone who tests positive by CDC guidelines should isolate, quarantine themselves for 5 days. At the end of 5 days, they can go out in public, they can go back to work. They should mask for a total of 5 more days. So 10 days from the beginning to the end of it. Some people are recommending, or some people are just on their own deciding to test at the end of 10 days. That testing is useful if the test comes back negative and you can say, good, I'm no longer contagious. If the test comes back positive, it's very difficult to interpret that. It could be that you have still active virus, but lower numbers than you would need to be able to transmit it to somebody else. It does take a fairly substantial viral load, in other words, number of virus fragments, for you to be able to transmit it to somebody else. It could be that you no longer have active virus in your system, but you still have some fragments of viral RNA, DNA. So in that case, you're not going to be contagious. There's a slight possibility that you could still have a significant viral load in your system, but there's no way to separate all those out. So the CDC is saying that after that 10-day period, you can consider yourself no longer contagious. the vast majority of the time, that's going to be correct.
Okay. And if they do get a negative test, is that a pretty good indicator that they are no longer contagious?
That is. One of the, also the downsides of this current virus is that particularly the home tests, the rapid tests, are not as good at picking up this variant as they were earlier variants. They're still pretty good, and they're still the best easy way we've got. A PCR test is going to be more sensitive, but it adds more expense, and really most CDC guidelines are not really requiring it now.
Okay, thank you. If you have tested positive for COVID and go through the 10 days, what is the likelihood that you could get it again? And should somebody who hasn't been boosted get boosted then at that point if they've already had it?
Thank you, Heather. There's no question, we all know people who have had it and got another virus, have had it 2 or 3 times. In general, that's pretty uncommon, but it still does happen. This is a contagious enough virus, and the immunity to it is in some ways not as strong as it was earlier on, although the immunity you do have will highly likely protect you against serious illness. I think that the likelihood of getting it again is completely going to be lower than the likelihood if you had not been vaccinated. And once you've had it, you are going to have some immunity against it. So your likelihood of getting it a second time is going to be lower than your likelihood the first time.
Sure.
Is the bottom line. You still can't get it, but you're going to be somewhat protected.
Great, thank you. A question about vaccines. It seems that, I think you mentioned this before, that this variant the vaccine doesn't protect as well against this variant and the booster. Can you speak a little bit to that? And I think there might be a new Omicron vaccine coming out this fall.
That's correct. The vaccine still protects very well, even with the Omicron BA.5, still protects very well against serious illness, hospitalization, intensive care unit stay, or needing to be on a ventilator, let alone death. It protects against all those things. It doesn't protect as well as it did against earlier variants from just getting sick. Mm-hmm. It's really a little bit more like a flu vaccine now in some ways. Every year we all take flu vaccines, even though depending on the year, the coverage is imperfect. But there's no doubt about it with this Omicron, with the COVID vaccine, it is going to protect against serious illness. A question you asked me earlier that I didn't answer was, if you've had the virus, should you get the vaccine again? Should you get a booster? In the early days, they were saying if you've had COVID, wait 90 days to get the vaccine. That advice has completely gone away now, and they're saying fairly shortly after you recover from COVID, you can go ahead and get the booster. It's going to help you. Having had the illness is going to help you. The vaccine is going to help you. All this kind of helps stack your immunity and give you the best chance.
Great. Let's talk about our children for a second. We know that now 5 and under are eligible for the vaccine. And they're preparing to go back to school. What are your recommendations for children of all ages? Should 5 and under get the full dose of the vaccine? Should our kids get boosted before they go back to school? And would you recommend them wear a mask?
I would recommend any child that is eligible for a vaccine get it. There's some question currently about children. I believe the cutoff's less than 5 getting booster. That hasn't really been recommended yet. If your doctor's recommending a booster, I would recommend, if your child's eligible for booster, get it. Children that are eligible for the vaccine, I would recommend getting it. Masks are still a good idea. In fact, Today Heather and I are without a mask, just really to have this, to be able to communicate as clearly as possible, but it's still a good idea to be wearing a mask even in these situations. School is the same boat. I think if kids can wear a mask, they should. It sort of falls in the category of kids ought to eat more vegetables and ought to wear a helmet when they're on the bike. The best you can do is the best you can do. And I know how hard it is to wear a mask all through the school day. If they were wearing a mask some of the time, that's better than none of the time. If they're wearing it all the time, that's better than some of the time. But, it's one of those things that's hard to completely follow. I still think masks are valuable. They're definitely preventing us from transmitting it to others. They probably protect the wearer a little bit, but more than that, they protect you from transmitting it if you are unlucky enough to have the virus. Still, a lot of people are going to be harboring the virus and never know it because there's still a lot of asymptomatic. Well, one thing I'm hearing from medical directors at the hospitals, I've talked to medical directors at Seton Medical Center Austin, Dell Seton, and Dell Children's, who've told me they really believe that the majority of people that are now in the hospital with COVID aren't in the hospital because they have COVID. They're in the hospital with something else, and they're all getting tested, and lo and behold, they get told you're testing positive.
Right.
So when you look at the hospital numbers, they really look worse than they really are. Most of those people are not hospitalized because of COVID.
And that's why we're seeing low numbers in ICU because...
Yeah, they're just not, this is not causing deep, lung trouble like the earlier viruses has. It's really kind of a whole different disease. It's kind of a matchup between the virus has changed a lot over the last 2 years, and we've changed a lot. That every infection is sort of a complex dance between the infectious agent, in this case the COVID virus, and the host, So you have to be a host to that virus, and we're just not as welcoming a host to the virus as we were. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. The virus is different too, so
sure.
The bottom line is it's just a less lethal thing. Not to say it's not still important. I mean, I think there's still good reasons not to get it. One reason is we still don't know who are the people that are most vulnerable to long COVID, sure. Having symptoms that last for months and months and don't seem to leave. The other reason really kind of to mask and to vaccinate is that you don't want to get it because every time you get it, the virus has an opportunity to learn a new trick, to mutate, to change. And anything we can do to slow its transmission means that the virus can't continue mutating the way it has.
I really appreciated, I had the opportunity to speak to you a couple days ago and you said that, and what a great picture of protecting not only ourselves but just the greater population, which is of course
exactly
what we are called to do and to care for our neighbors. So I appreciate those words.
Heather, something else I wanted to mention too. I've been looking at the curves, for the last 2 years. If you go to Austin Public Health dashboards, they will display for you a curve of both how many are testing positive, how many people are in the hospital, and they go back to early 2020. And if you look at it, there's a really clear curve. It's like waves. It literally is like waves. And at least my reading is I'm seeing ever since 2020, here in Central Texas, this is not the case for all the country, but here in Central Texas, there tends to be a peak around January and then another one around July. And these peaks from the time it takes off to the time it comes back to baseline last 2 months, 3 months. The max is 4 months. This current peak is flatter. It's not nearly as spiky a peak as it's been in the past. That's good news. Mm-hmm. But the important thing is these peaks last for a while and then come back down to baseline. And I think that's what we've seen, and I think we're probably going to see that for a while. Mm-hmm. And I think the good news in this is if the pattern holds, that you can sort of predict, when you're in a peak that, another month and a half or two, this is going to be gone and we'll be at least back down to a baseline. So at those times, we'll be able to go out and feel a little more comfortable in groups, feel a little more comfortable having people over the house, just kind of socializing, going back to more of a normal life. I think holding the expectation that one of these peaks may come after that is a reasonable thing to think. And just like, you wouldn't get rid of a raincoat and an umbrella just because it's rained and you think you're done with that. I think we, need to remain vigilant and recognize that at some point we may need to mask for a while, may need to isolate from people a little more, at least distance from people a little bit more, with the clear understanding that this too shall pass and we'll be back into a phase where we can go around people more again.
Thank you. That leads me to one of my final questions. I know when this started back in March 2020, my mom had a trip planned with some of her teammates from a high school that she teaches at. And my advice to her was to cancel, that it wasn't worth it, and that this was just a season that we were going through. Well, it no longer feels like a season 2 years later. So if I had known then what I know now, I think my advice would be a little bit different. But it doesn't feel like this is really coming to an end anytime soon. So can you give us your advice on that and what we should anticipate?
Well, I really feel like when I talk to clinicians, I've talked to a lot of them, the vast majority are saying they don't really think that this is going to end. They think we're now entering more of an endemic phase, which just means it's kind of an ongoing thing. I think we're ending the pandemic part, and I think the pattern I discussed earlier with peaks and valleys, which I think are more pronounced here in Central Texas. I don't hear people like Dr. Fauci and other public health authorities talking about these peaks and valleys as much as what I'm seeing, but I really do believe it's real, at least here in Central Texas. So I think you can count on these peaks and valleys for a while. I know we were planning a big reunion for my high school class earlier this year, and we were sort of still in a peak in January. People were really worried, can we have this thing? And I said, you know what, we're planning on this for being April. I think we'll be out of this peak by then, and I think we'll be back in sort of a trough, and I think we'll be safe to be around each other. Nobody really knew, but that turned out to be the case. And maybe that doesn't hold true every time, but I think so far that's been a pretty clear pattern, and I'm hopeful that that remains. And I think there's reason to hope this goes away, completely. And yet I think we need to brace ourselves for this, being a pattern for, the future for a while at least, and be able to hunker down when it's in a peak and be able to enjoy the time when we're in a relative trough, or when things are when the numbers are low in Central Texas, and enjoy it.
Finding a new rhythm for the season that we're in.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
It's a rhythm of the season.
Any final words or any words of encouragement you want to leave everybody with?
Well, I think we've been really successful here at UUMC. I really do. I'm struck with how the entire congregation has really supported the measures we put in place, and we thank you all for that. And I think we'll continue to be successful. As you know, we're hearing about a lot more people having it. We had a youth trip this week, and we had a small outbreak there. And yet, based on what we now know, we didn't have to end the youth trip or do any kind of lockdown. It was something that we were able to kind of accept in stride and keep having the trip. And I think more and more that's the way we're going to be living. And I'm reminded we made it this far, and I think we still will. There's an old spiritual called "I Don't Feel No Ways Tired," And the refrain of that typically the congregation will sing over and over again is, I can't believe he brought me this far just to leave me. And I really think that's where we are. I think we've made it this far. We're going to be able to keep on keeping on, and we're going to all be all right.
Well, we sure appreciate you and taking time to do this, and all the wisdom and knowledge that you have to share is very helpful to not only me, but to our entire congregation. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate you.